Jonas Lambert smirked as he gestured dismissively at me. Look at Jean, still playing dress-up like she matters. His friends erupted in laughter around the conference table. I smiled calmly. Of course he didn't know that Morrison Tech, the company paying his salary, was mine. By Thursday morning, his arrogance would crumble when security escorted him to my office, and he saw my name on the door. But let me start from the beginning, because the road to that moment was paved with months of careful planning, and a betrayal that cut deeper than any business deal ever could.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The fluorescent lights of Morrison Tech's 23rd floor cast harsh shadows across the conference room, as I sat quietly in the corner, notebook in hand, watching Jonas Lambert hold court like he owned the place. In a way, I suppose he thought he did. After all, he was the senior vice president of operations, the golden boy who'd been fast-tracked through promotions, the man everyone assumed would be running the company within 5 years. What none of them knew, what I'd worked very hard to keep secret, was that I already did run the company. Every single one of them. Jean-Claude, Jonas called out, his voice dripping with condescension as he turned to face me. The entire room fell silent, all eyes shifting to where I sat with my simple black dress and understated jewelry. Since you're here taking notes like some kind of intern, maybe you can enlighten us about the quarterly projections. A few snickers rippled through the room. Kevin Morrison, the head of marketing, was grinning like this was the most entertaining thing he'd seen all week. Tom Eaton from finance was practically vibrating with suppressed laughter. Even Clara Lambert, Jonas's wife and the human resources director, had that cruel smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I looked up from my notebook, meeting Jonas's gaze steadily. Which projections specifically were you hoping I'd address? Jonas's smirk widened. He was enjoying this, the way a cat enjoys toying with a mouse before the kill. Well, since you seem to think you belong in these executive meetings, why don't you share your insights on our expansion strategy? I'm sure someone with your limited experience has valuable input. The insult hung in the air, like smoke. Limited experience. I had been attending these meetings for 6 months now, introduced as an administrative consultant, brought in to observe and take notes. It was a cover story I'd crafted carefully, one that allowed me to watch the inner workings of my own company, without anyone suspecting who I really was. But Jonas had been pushing boundaries for weeks now. The dismissive comments, the casual cruelty, the way he treated me like I was some sort of corporate charity case, who'd wandered into the wrong room. Today, apparently, he'd decided to make it a public spectacle. Actually, I said, setting my pen down carefully, I think the expansion strategy has some fundamental flaws that could cost the company millions if not addressed properly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kevin's grin faltered. Tom stopped fidgeting with his phone. Even Clara's cruel smile wavered slightly. Jonas, however, looked absolutely delighted. Oh really, please enlighten us. I'm sure the board would love to hear your expert opinion on strategy. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the picture of smug confidence. This was exactly what he'd been building toward, the moment where he could publicly humiliate me in front of the entire executive team. Make me look foolish. Put me in my place. What he didn't realize was that he was about to hand me everything I needed to destroy him. Well, I began, keeping my voice level and professional. The current expansion plan assumes a 15% market growth rate, but the data shows we're looking at closer to 8%. The budget allocations are based on outdated projections, and the timeline doesn't account for the regulatory changes coming in Q3. I paused, watching the confusion creep across their faces. This wasn't the fumbling response they'd expected from the quiet woman in the corner. Furthermore, I continued, the staffing projections assume we can hire and train qualified personnel at 30% below market rate, which is unrealistic in the current job market. And the technology infrastructure costs are underestimated by at least 40%, based on the vendor quotes I've seen. Jonas's smirk was fading fast. And how exactly would you know about vendor quotes? I smiled. It was a gentle smile, the kind that didn't quite reach my eyes, because I pay attention to details. It's amazing what you can learn when people assume you're invisible. The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Tom had gone pale. Clara's mouth was slightly open, as if she couldn't quite process what she'd just heard. But Jonas was angry now. The public humiliation he'd planned for me had backfired spectacularly, and in front of his entire team. His face was flushing red, his jaw clenched tight. "That's enough," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're completely out of line. This is an executive meeting, not some classroom where you get to play teacher." He stood up, looming over me, his voice rising with each word. "You want to know what I think? I think you're pathetic, sitting there in your discount store clothes, pretending like you understand how business works. You're nothing but a glorified secretary who's gotten too big for her britches." The words hit like physical blows. Around the table, his friends were nodding along, their initial shock giving way to renewed confidence in their leader. Kevin actually chuckled. Tom smirked. Clara looked relieved that the natural order was being restored. "You don't belong here," Jonas continued, his voice dripping with venom. "You never did. And frankly, I'm going to recommend to the board that your little consulting contract gets terminated. We don't need dead weight dragging down this company." I sat perfectly still, absorbing every word, every insult, every casual cruelty. Let them have their moment. Let them think they'd won. Because in 3 days, when the quarterly board meeting convened, they would learn exactly who Jean-Claude really was. They would discover that the woman they'd just humiliated owned every brick of this building, every computer on every desk, every stock option in their portfolios. They would learn that the pathetic woman in discount store clothes was the sole proprietor of Morrison Tech, the company that paid their salaries, funded their bonuses, and held their careers in the palm of her hand. But for now, I simply nodded, gathered my notebook, and stood to leave. "Thank you for the feedback," I said quietly. "I'll be sure to pass it along to the appropriate parties." Jonas laughed. Actually laughed as I walked toward the door. "You do that? I'm sure they'll be very interested in your insights." Oh, they would be. More interested than he could possibly imagine. As I reached for the door handle, I turned back one last time. Jonas was grinning triumphantly, basking in the admiration of his sycophantic team. He had no idea that he'd just sealed his own fate. "See you Thursday, Jonas," I said softly. Something in my tone made him pause, made that confident grin flicker for just a moment. But then Kevin made some joke about discount store consultants, and the moment passed. I walked out, leaving them to their laughter and their cruelty and their absolute certainty that they had won. They had no idea the war had only just begun. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt endless, each floor marking another layer of memories I'd buried beneath months of careful planning. As the numbers descended, 20, 15, 10, I found myself thinking about the day I'd first walked into this building, not as Jean-Claude, the mysterious consultant, but as the 28-year-old entrepreneur who just signed the deed that made her the sole owner of Morrison Tech. That was 18 months ago, back when I still believed in the basic decency of people. Back when I thought that if you treated employees well, paid them fairly, and gave them opportunities to grow, they would respect the company and its mission. How naive I'd been.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The elevator dinged softly as it reached the basement level. I stepped out, my heels echoing against the concrete walls as I walked toward my car, a modest Honda Civic that I'd deliberately chosen to maintain my cover. Jonas drove a BMW. Kevin had a Mercedes. Even Tom, who was supposedly just the finance director, had managed to afford a luxury SUV on his salary. My salary. The salary I paid them. I slid into the driver's seat and sat for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. In the quiet of the parking garage, I could finally drop the mask I'd been wearing for 6 months. The careful composure, the deferential posture, the way I made myself smaller and quieter so they wouldn't see me as a threat. Because the truth was, I had built Morrison Tech from nothing. Absolutely nothing. 5 years ago, I was working 18-hour days in a cramped studio apartment, living on ramen noodles and energy drinks, writing code that would eventually become the foundation of our flagship software platform. I'd maxed out 3 credit cards, borrowed money from friends who believed in my vision, and spent every waking moment perfecting a product that I knew could revolutionize how mid-size companies managed their operations. The early days were brutal, rejection after rejection from investors who took one look at a young woman with no corporate pedigree and dismissed me before I could finish my pitch. Banks that wouldn't even consider a loan application. Venture capital firms that suggested I might be better suited for a support role in someone else's company. But I persevered. I found angel investors who saw potential where others saw risk. I hired brilliant developers who shared my vision. I worked weekends, holidays, and sick days because I knew that Morrison Tech could be something special. And it was. Within 2 years, we had our first major client. Within 3 years, we were profitable. By year 4, we were competing with industry giants and winning. That's when I made what I now realized was my first critical mistake. I started delegating. Success meant growth, and growth meant I couldn't do everything myself anymore. I needed executives who could handle operations while I focused on product development and strategic vision. I needed people I could trust to run the day-to-day business while I worked on scaling our technology. Jonas Lambert had seemed like the perfect choice. Harvard MBA, 10 years of experience at Fortune 500 companies, impeccable references. During his interview, he'd spoken passionately about building collaborative teams and fostering innovation. He'd talked about respecting every employee's contribution and creating an environment where the best ideas could flourish, regardless of their source. I'd believed every word. Kevin Morrison had been my second hire for the executive team. Northwestern graduate, impressive track record in marketing and brand development. He'd promised to help Morrison Tech establish itself as a thought leader in the industry. He'd spoken about integrity in communications and building authentic relationships with clients. Another mistake. Tom Eaton came next, recruited from a prestigious accounting firm, with promises of bringing world-class financial management to our growing company. He'd assured me that he understood the unique challenges facing tech startups and was committed to sustainable growth over quick profits. The biggest mistake of all. But the betrayal that cut deepest was Clara Lambert. Jonas's wife, yes, but also someone I'd considered a friend. I'd hired her as HR director, after we'd met at a Women in Business networking event. She'd talked about creating inclusive workplaces and supporting other women in leadership. When she'd mentioned that her husband was looking for new opportunities, I'd seen it as a perfect fit, a power couple, who could help Morrison Tech reach the next level. I'd trusted them, all of them. I'd given them generous salaries, comprehensive benefits, stock options that would make them wealthy when we eventually went public. I'd treated them as partners, not just employees. And slowly, systematically, they'd begun to push me out of my own company. It started small. Jonas would schedule important meetings during times when I was traveling for client presentations. Kevin would make strategic decisions without consulting me, then present them as fate's accomplice. Tom would question every expense I approved, while rubber-stamping lavish purchases for the executive team. Clara was perhaps the most insidious. She'd begun subtly undermining my authority by expressing concerns about my management style to other employees. She'd suggest that perhaps I was too emotionally invested in certain decisions, that maybe I needed to step back and let the experienced executives handle things. The final straw had come 6 months ago. During what was supposed to be a routine board meeting, Jonas had stood up and delivered a presentation about organizational restructuring that essentially removed me from all operational oversight. I would retain the title of CEO, he'd explained, but the company needed professional management to reach its full potential. The board, composed of the early investors who'd believed in my vision, had approved the plan unanimously. They trusted Jonas's credentials more than my instincts. They saw his Harvard MBA and assumed it trumped my intimate knowledge of the company I'd built from scratch. That night, I'd gone home to my penthouse apartment, the one luxury I'd allowed myself after Morrison Tech's first profitable year, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I was going to take my company back. But I wasn't going to do it through boardroom politics or legal challenges. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms, using their rules in their arena. I was going to do something much more elegant, much more devastating. I was going to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The consultant cover story had been brilliant, if I said so myself. Jean-Claude, a combination of my middle name and my grandmother's maiden name, was a mysterious figure with impeccable credentials, but a deliberately low profile. She'd worked for Fortune 100 companies, but had signed so many NDAs that her specific achievements couldn't be discussed. She was expensive but worth it, brought in to observe and analyze before the company's upcoming IPO. The executive team had accepted the story because it stroked their egos. Of course, Morrison Tech was important enough to warrant high-level consulting. Of course, they were impressive enough to be studied by someone with Jean-Claude's supposed background. For 6 months, I'd sat in their meetings, listened to their conversations, watched them make decisions about my company while treating me like an invisible secretary. I documented every casual cruelty, every moment of disrespect, every instance where they'd revealed their true contempt for the woman who'd given them everything they had. And now, finally, it was time to collect. I started the car and pulled out of the parking garage, my mind already racing through the preparations I needed to make for Thursday's board meeting. Jonas thought he'd humiliated me today. He thought he'd put me in my place, reminded me of my proper position in the hierarchy he'd constructed around my own company. He had no idea that his pathetic target owned every single thing he thought made him powerful. But he was about to learn. I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage 30 minutes later, but instead of going upstairs, I sat in my car and opened my laptop. The building's Wi-Fi reached the lower levels, and I had work to do. Real work, not the carefully orchestrated performance I'd been putting on at Morrison Tech. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I accessed the company's internal systems I'd designed, systems that recognized my administrative access, even under my Jean-Claude identity. What I found made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of rage and determination. Jonas hadn't wasted any time. There in the digital paper trail of Morrison Tech's executive communications was an email thread that had started less than an hour after I'd left the conference room. The subject line read, "Consultant situation action required." I clicked it open, my jaw tightening as I read Jonas's message to the executive team. "After today's incident with the clawed woman, I think we need to move quickly to address this situation. She's clearly overstepped her boundaries and seems to have some delusional ideas about her role here. I'm recommending we terminate her contract immediately and bring in someone more appropriate for our needs. I have someone in mind who would be a much better fit. Let's discuss first thing tomorrow." Kevin had replied within minutes. "Agreed." She was completely out of line. "Your call on the replacement." Tom's response was even more cutting. "Thank God. I was wondering how long we'd have to put up with her little power trips." She acted like she actually understood our business. But it was Clara's reply that made my hands shake with barely contained fury. "I'll handle the contract termination paperwork. And Jonas, if you're thinking of bringing in Alba Eaton, I think that's perfect. She'll be much more manageable than our current consultant. Plus, she actually understands how to respect the chain of command." Alba Eaton, Tom's younger sister. A woman with a marketing degree from a mid-tier state school and exactly 3 years of experience at a regional consulting firm that specialized in small business tax preparation. I leaned back in my car seat, staring at the screen in disbelief. They weren't just planning to fire me, they were planning to replace me with someone whose primary qualification was being related to one of them. Someone who would nod along with their decisions, validate their choices, and never challenge their authority. Someone who would be grateful for the opportunity and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about expansion strategies or budget allocations. I scrolled through the rest of the email thread, watching as they planned my professional execution with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this before. Clara had already drafted a termination letter citing professional incompatibility and failure to maintain appropriate consultant boundaries. Kevin was working on a press release that would announce Alba's hiring as a strategic enhancement to our pre-IPO advisory team. Jonas had even scheduled a celebration dinner for Friday night, the day after they planned to fire me, to welcome Alba to the team. The audacity was breathtaking. They were planning to celebrate replacing me with someone completely unqualified, using company funds I provided, while congratulating themselves on their decisive leadership. But what made it worse, what made my chest tight with a rage I hadn't felt since the day they'd voted to push me out of operational control, was reading the casual cruelty in their messages. The way they talked about me like I was some annoying pest they'd finally found an excuse to squash. Jonas's follow-up message was particularly enlightening. "One more thing. I want to make sure we handle this professionally. When we terminate Claude, I don't want any drama or scenes. Clara, please make sure security is available when we deliver the news. Based on her behavior today, I wouldn't put it past her to become unstable. We need to protect ourselves and our reputation." Security. They were planning to have security escort me out of my own building. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of the parking garage, processing what I'd just read. For 6 months, I'd watched them disrespect me, dismiss my contributions, and treat me like an irrelevant observer. But this was different. This wasn't just professional disregard, this was personal malice. They enjoyed humiliating me. They got satisfaction from putting me in my place, from reminding me that I was nothing more than a disposable service provider who could be replaced on a whim. Jonas, in particular, seemed to relish the power dynamic. The way he'd spoken to me in that conference room, the deliberate cruelty in his voice when he'd called me pathetic, that wasn't just professional dismissal. that was someone who enjoyed inflicting pain on people he perceived as beneath him. And now he was planning to fire me with security present, as if I were some kind of threat to be managed rather than a professional to be respected. I thought about Alba Eaton, Tom's sister, who would be sitting in that conference room next week, nodding along with their brilliant strategies while they congratulated themselves on upgrading their consultant. Alba, who would smile prettily and defer to their expertise, who would never challenge their assumptions or point out their mistakes. Alba, who would watch Morrison Tech make the same catastrophic errors I'd been trying to prevent, and who would say nothing because she wouldn't even recognize the problems. The irony was almost poetic. They were so eager to get rid of me that they were willing to replace expert analysis with incompetent validation. They preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, even when those truths could save their careers, because that's what they didn't understand about the expansion strategy I'd criticized. The flaws I'd pointed out weren't just academic observations, they were genuine threats to the company's stability. The budget miscalculations, the unrealistic staffing projections, the underestimated infrastructure costs, those weren't minor issues that could be smoothed over with optimistic thinking. They were the kind of mistakes that could bankrupt a company. Morrison Tech's board meeting on Thursday wasn't just about revealing my identity, it was about preventing them from destroying everything I'd built while they celebrated their own cleverness. I opened my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for: Robert Chen, Morrison Tech's original angel investor and current board chairman. Robert had been one of the first people to believe in my vision, back when I was just a determined young woman with a promising software prototype and no business experience. More importantly, Robert had been growing increasingly concerned about the company's direction under Jonas's leadership. I'd been monitoring the board communications for months, watching as Robert questioned the executive team's decisions and pushed back against their more aggressive strategies. I crafted a message carefully: Robert, this is Jean. I have some concerns about Thursday's board meeting that I think we should discuss privately before the session. Are you available for a brief call tomorrow afternoon? There are some strategic issues that require immediate attention. Jean. I hesitated for just a moment before hitting send. Once I started down this path, there would be no going back. Thursday's board meeting would either be my complete vindication or my absolute destruction. But as I thought about Jonas's smirk, about Clara's cruel smile, about the way they'd laughed while planning to humiliate me with security escorts and replacement consultants, the choice became clear. They wanted to play power games with someone they saw as powerless. It was time to show them what real power looked like. My phone buzzed with Robert's response: Jean, I've been hoping to hear from you. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. works perfectly. I think it's time we had an overdue conversation about Morrison Tech's future. I smiled for the first time since leaving that conference room. Game on. The next morning, I arrived at Morrison Tech an hour earlier than usual, slipping into the building before the executive team's typical 9 a.m. arrival. I had a mission, and it required careful timing. I made my way to the 15th floor, where the mid-level managers and department heads worked. These were the people who actually ran Morrison Tech on a daily basis, the ones who implemented the executive team's decisions, managed the real work, and dealt with the consequences of every strategic choice made 23 floors above them. They were also the ones who had started to notice that something was seriously wrong with the company's direction. I found exactly who I was looking for in the quality assurance department. Emma Morrison, Kevin's older sister, and one of the most respected managers in the company. The irony, her last name wasn't lost on me. When I'd founded Morrison Tech, I'd chosen the name as a tribute to my grandmother, Emma Morrison, who had taught me that true strength came from persistence and principle. Emma was at her desk, reviewing code testing reports, with the focused intensity that had made her legendary among the development teams. Unlike her brother Kevin, who had coasted on charm and connections, Emma had earned every promotion through competence and dedication. I said softly, approaching her cubicle. "Do you have a moment?" She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. Most employees barely acknowledged my existence, the mysterious consultant who sat quietly in executive meetings and took notes. But Emma had always been different. She'd nod politely when we passed in the hallways, and once she'd even held an elevator for me when my arms were full of files. "Of course, Jean. What can I do for you?" I glanced around the open office space, noting that most of the other early arrivals were absorbed in their own work. Still, I lowered my voice. "I was wondering if you might have time for coffee this afternoon. There are some things about the company's direction that I think you should know about." Emma's eyes sharpened. "What kind of things?" "The kind that affect everyone who works here," I said carefully, "including you and your team." She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The cafe downstairs? 3 o'clock? Perfect. And Emma?" I paused, making sure she was paying attention. "Thank you for being willing to listen." Something in my tone must have conveyed the gravity of what I was feeling, because her expression grew more serious. "Is everything okay, Jean?" I managed a small smile. "It will be. After Thursday's board meeting, it will be." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated encounters. I spoke briefly with Marcus Chen from the development team, no relation to board chairman Robert Chen, despite the surname, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the technical decisions being made by people who hadn't written code in years. I had a quiet conversation with Sarah Lambert from client relations. Again, no family connection to Jonas and Clara, just an unfortunate coincidence of names, who had been fielding an increasing number of complaints from clients concerned about service quality degradation. Each conversation was brief, careful, and seemingly casual. I didn't reveal anything about my true identity or my plans for Thursday's board meeting. I simply asked questions, listened to their concerns, and suggested that we talk more after the upcoming board meeting. But what I heard during those conversations confirmed everything I'd suspected about the real state of Morrison Tech under Jonas's leadership. The expansion strategy that Jonas was pushing through wasn't just financially reckless, it was operationally impossible. The development teams were already stretched thin trying to maintain current service levels. The client relations department was struggling to handle existing accounts. The QA team was finding more bugs than ever because they were being pressured to rush testing cycles. Everyone could see the problems. Everyone was worried about the company's future. But no one felt empowered to speak up, because the executive team had created a culture where questioning their decisions was seen as disloyalty. At 2 p.m., I called Robert Chen from the privacy of my car in the parking garage. "Jean," he answered immediately. "I've been looking forward to this conversation. Robert, I need to ask you something directly. How do you really feel about the current leadership team's performance?" There was a long pause. "Off the record, completely. I'm concerned," he said finally. "When we brought Jonas and his team in, we thought we were getting experienced leadership that could take Morrison Tech to the next level. But the more I see of their strategies, the more I wonder if we made a mistake." My heart started beating faster. "What specifically worries you?" "The expansion plan they're pushing is incredibly aggressive. When I ask about risk mitigation, I get buzzwords and PowerPoint slides instead of concrete answers. When I question their assumptions, they dismiss my concerns as outdated thinking." He paused, and frankly, the company culture has changed. There's less innovation, less collaboration, more politics and ego. What if I told you that I've documented specific examples of financial miscalculations, operational impossibilities, and strategic blind spots in their current plans? I'd say I want to see that documentation immediately. And what if I told you that I have a solution? A way to address the leadership issues while preserving everything that made Morrison Tech successful in the first place. Another long pause. Gene, are you about to tell me something that's going to change everything? I smiled. Robert, I'm about to tell you something that's going to save this company. An hour later, I was sitting across from Emma Morrison in the small cafe on Morrison Tech's ground floor. The space was nearly empty. Most employees ate lunch earlier or later to avoid the crowds. Emma had ordered a latte and was turning the cup nervously in her hands. Okay, Jean, you have my attention. What's going on? I took a deep breath. This was the moment where I had to decide how much to reveal, how much to trust someone I barely knew but whose competence I'd observed for months. Emma, what would you say if I told you that Morrison Tech is about to make decisions that could destroy everything this company has built? Her eyes widened. I'd say that matches what I've been seeing from my level. The technical requirements for this expansion don't make sense. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the personnel, and we don't have the quality control systems to support what they're planning. And if you tried to raise those concerns with the executive team, she laughed bitterly. I did try. Last month, Kevin told me that technical concerns weren't strategic priorities, and that I should trust the leadership team to handle the big picture. Your own brother dismissed your expertise. Kevin stopped seeing me as a sister or a colleague years ago. Now I'm just another mid-level employee who doesn't understand business strategy. Her voice carried a pain that went beyond professional frustration. It's like he's become a different person since he got that executive position. I leaned forward. Emma, what if I told you that there's going to be a board meeting on Thursday that could change everything? That there's a possibility the current leadership structure might be reconsidered? She stared at me. How could you possibly know that? Because I've been documenting everything. Every strategic mistake, every operational oversight, every financial miscalculation. And I'm not the only one who's been paying attention. Emma set down her coffee cup, her hands steadier now. Who are you, Jean? Really? I met her gaze steadily. I'm someone who cares about this company more than you can imagine. Someone who's been watching talented people like you get dismissed and ignored by people who think credentials matter more than competence. And after Thursday's board meeting, after Thursday, I think you'll find that Morrison Tech remembers what made it successful in the first place. That technical expertise matters. That employee input is valued. That the people who do the actual work have voices worth hearing. Emma nodded slowly. And what do you need from me? Just be ready, I said. Be ready to speak up when you're asked for your honest assessment of the company's direction. Be ready to tell the truth about what you've observed, what you've experienced, and what you think needs to change. I can do that. And Emma, when all of this is over, when the dust settles, I want you to know that your dedication hasn't gone unnoticed. Your competence hasn't been invisible. There are people who see your value even if your brother doesn't. For the first time since I'd known her, Emma Morrison smiled with genuine hope. Thank you, Jean. For whatever you're doing, whoever you really are, thank you. As I walked back to the elevator, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of building alliances instead of enduring isolation. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Thursday was the board meeting, and by Friday, Morrison Tech would either be saved or lost forever. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have felt invigorating, but instead felt ominous. As I walked through Morrison Tech's lobby, I noticed something different in the atmosphere, a tension that seemed to crackle through the usual morning routine of employees getting coffee and checking emails. I soon discovered why. The elevator was more crowded than usual, and I found myself pressed against the back wall, listening to fragments of hushed conversations that made my blood run cold. Heard they're firing the consultant today. About time, honestly. She was getting way too big for her britches. Jonas called an all-hands meeting for this afternoon. Something about maintaining professional standards. My stomach dropped. They weren't waiting until after the board meeting. They were planning to fire me today, in front of the entire company, as some kind of public example. I managed to maintain my composure until I reached the 23rd floor, but as soon as the elevator doors closed behind the last executive assistant, I felt my hands start to shake. This wasn't just about removing me from the consulting role anymore. This was about public humiliation, about making sure everyone in the company understood what happened to people who challenged the executive team's authority. I made it to my usual corner spot in the conference room, just as Jonas strode in, looking more pleased with himself than I'd ever seen.
Yeah.
Kevin and Tom flanked him like loyal lieutenants, their expressions matching his satisfied smirk. Clara brought up the rear, carrying a folder that I suspected contained my termination paperwork. "Good morning, everyone," Jonas announced, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. "Before we begin today's agenda, I have an important announcement to make about our consulting arrangements." He turned to look directly at me, and I saw something ugly flash in his eyes. This wasn't just professional, this was personal revenge for daring to challenge him in front of his team. As you all know, we've been working with an external consultant for the past several months. Unfortunately, it's become clear that this arrangement is no longer serving the company's best interests. His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was cruelty underneath it. "Effective immediately, we're terminating this consulting relationship due to professional incompatibility and inappropriate conduct." The room fell silent. I could feel eyes turning toward me, some curious, some sympathetic, most carefully neutral. No one wanted to be associated with the person Jonas was publicly executing. But Jonas wasn't finished. "I want to be clear about why we're taking this action," he continued, his voice growing harder. "Yesterday, this consultant presumed to lecture the executive team about strategy, despite having no authority, no real understanding of our business, and frankly, no qualifications to speak on these matters." Kevin nodded gravely. "It was completely inappropriate." "Unprofessional," Tom added. Clara stepped forward with her folder. "I have the termination documentation right here." Jonas smiled, the expression sharp and satisfied. "What's particularly troubling is the arrogance displayed. The complete lack of understanding about her place in this organization. The delusional belief that she somehow knew better than the experienced professionals who actually run this company." Each word was chosen carefully, designed to humiliate and diminish. Around the table, I could see some employees shifting uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one defended me. The executive team had created such a culture of fear that even witnessing injustice, people were afraid to respond. "This is what happens," Jonas continued, his voice rising slightly with the passion of someone delivering a sermon, "when people forget their place, when they confuse being invited to observe with having the right to participate, when they mistake temporary access for permanent authority." He was enjoying this. Every word, every calculated insult, every moment of my public degradation was feeding something dark in him. "Security will be escorting our former consultant from the building immediately after this meeting," he announced. "And I want everyone to understand that this is how we handle people who don't respect the chain of command, who don't understand professional boundaries, who think they can waltz in here and disrupt the work that real professionals are doing." The words hung in the air like poison. Security escort. Former consultant. Real professionals. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my expression calm. Let him have his moment. Let him feel powerful and vindicated, and absolutely certain that he had won. Because in less than 24 hours, he would learn exactly who the real professional in this room actually was. Jonas turned to Clara. Do you have anything to add about the termination process? Clara stepped forward, practically glowing with satisfaction. The consulting contract is terminated immediately. All access badges will be deactivated within the hour. Security has been notified to ensure a smooth transition. She looked directly at me, her smile cold and satisfied. I think everyone can learn from this situation. About respect, about knowing your place, about understanding that expertise comes from credentials and experience, not from presumption and arrogance. The final insult. From the woman I had hired, who I had trusted, who I had considered a friend. Jonas nodded approvingly. Exactly. Now, let's move on to more important matters. The expansion strategy presentation needs final approval before tomorrow's board meeting. Where they planned to present their flawed strategy to the board, where they expected to be applauded for their decisive leadership in removing a problematic consultant, where they would instead discover that the woman they had just publicly humiliated was the owner of everything they thought they controlled. Any questions before we proceed? Jonas asked, his tone making it clear that questions were not actually welcome. Silence. Excellent. Then let's get to work. Real work, by real professionals, without any more disruptions. I stood up slowly, gathering my notebook and pen with careful deliberation. Every eye in the room was on me, watching to see if I would break, if I would argue, if I would give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble under their collective contempt. Instead, I smiled. Not the bitter smile of someone plotting revenge, not the fake smile of someone trying to hide their pain. A genuine peaceful smile of someone who knew something the rest of the room didn't. Thank you all for this educational experience, I said softly. I'll be sure to remember everything that happened here today. Jonas frowned slightly, as if my calm response wasn't quite what he'd expected, but then his confidence returned. Security is waiting outside to escort you out. Of course they are, I replied. I'll see you all very soon. Something in my tone made several people look up sharply, but I was already walking toward the door, my head high, my steps steady. As I reached the doorway, I turned back one final time. Jonas was already moving on, pulling up his presentation slides, basking in his victory. Oh, and Jonas, I said quietly. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Enjoy the rest of your day. I have a feeling tomorrow is going to be very different for all of us. And with that I walked out, leaving them to puzzle over my words, while security escorted the owner of Morrison Tech from her own building. The security guard who escorted me to the parking garage was a man named David who'd been working at Morrison Tech since the early days. I'd hired him personally 3 years ago, though he had no idea who I really was. As we walked through the lobby, I could feel the stares of employees who had witnessed my public humiliation, but David maintained a professional demeanor that suggested he found the whole situation distasteful. Miss Claude, he said, quietly, as we reached my car, I want you to know that not everyone up there agrees with what just happened. I looked at him with surprise. David had always been the silent, professional type who kept his opinions to himself. I've been watching this company change over the past year, he continued, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed. It used to be a place where people respected each other, where good ideas mattered more than politics. What they did to you up there, that's not the Morrison Tech I signed up to protect. His words hit me harder than I expected. Here was a man who had no reason to defend me, no knowledge of my true identity, but who had seen enough to recognize injustice when it happened. Thank you, David, I said softly. That means more than you know. He nodded and stepped back, allowing me to get into my car. As I drove away from Morrison Tech, I caught sight of him in my rear-view mirror, still standing there, watching me leave with an expression that looked like regret. I drove aimlessly for an hour, not ready to go home, not ready to face the reality of what had just happened. Despite all my planning, despite knowing this moment was coming, the actual experience of being publicly humiliated and escorted out of my own building had shaken me more than I'd anticipated. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of Riverside Park, a quiet space along the river where I'd often come to think during the early days of building Morrison Tech. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching the current carry fallen leaves downstream, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. For 6 months, I had endured disrespect, dismissal, and casual cruelty. I had watched people I'd trusted transform into strangers who treated me like an inconvenience. I had listened to them plan my destruction while they celebrated their own brilliance. But today had been different. Today they hadn't just dismissed me, they had tried to humiliate me so thoroughly that I would never recover. They had wanted to break me, to make sure I understood exactly how powerless they believed me to be. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so painful. My phone buzzed with a text message. Robert Chen, Jean. I heard about what happened today. Are you all right? We still have our meeting tomorrow, correct? I stared at the message, feeling something shift inside me. Yesterday, I had been planning to reveal my identity as a strategic move to save the company. Today it had become something more personal, a reckoning that was long overdue. I typed back, "I'm fine, Robert. And yes, tomorrow's meeting is more important than ever. You're about to learn some very interesting things about Morrison Tech." His response came quickly, "I'm looking forward to it. Between you and me, what happened today was completely inappropriate. The board needs to address the leadership culture issue." Leadership culture issue. If only he knew. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for tomorrow's board meeting with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. This wasn't just about business strategy anymore, it was about justice. It was about showing Jonas and his team that their cruelty had consequences. It was about proving that respect and competence mattered more than politics and credentials. But most importantly, it was about reclaiming the company I had built from people who had never understood what made it special. As the sun began to set, I drove to Morrison Tech's parking garage one last time as Jean-Claude, the dismissed consultant. Tomorrow, I would return as the owner, and nothing would ever be the same. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking up at the building that represented 5 years of my life's work. In 18 hours, Jonas would walk into the boardroom, expecting to present his expansion strategy to a group of impressed investors. Instead, he would find himself face to face with the woman he had just humiliated, sitting at the head of the table as the sole owner of everything he thought he controlled. The thought should have filled me with satisfaction. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. This confrontation would end careers, destroy relationships, and fundamentally change the company I loved. There would be casualties beyond just the executive team, employees would lose their jobs, projects would be disrupted, and the stable world that hundreds of people depended on would be shattered. But as I remembered Jonas's cruel smile, Clara's satisfied smirk, and the way they had orchestrated my public humiliation for their own entertainment, I knew there was no other choice. They had created this situation through their own arrogance and contempt. Tomorrow's reckoning was not revenge, it was consequences. I started the car and drove home to prepare for the most important day in Morrison Tech's history. Tomorrow, the real Jean-Claude would finally step out of the shadows. Thursday morning arrived with an electricity in the air that I could feel the moment I woke up. Today was the day everything would change, not just for me, but for everyone at Morrison Tech who had been watching the company they loved slowly transform into something unrecognizable. I chose my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had left me. The same grandmother, whose maiden name had become my cover identity. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone who was ready to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But first, I had calls to make. At 7 a.m., I dialed Emma Morrison's direct line. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Jean, I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay, Emma. In fact, I'm calling because I need you to do something important today. Can you gather Marcus from development and Sarah from client relations? I need the three of you to attend this morning's board meeting." "The board meeting? Jean, I don't think we're supposed to trust me," I said, cutting her off gently. "You're not only supposed to be there, you're required to be there. Tell your supervisors that your attendance has been specifically requested by ownership." A long pause. "Ownership? Just be there, Emma. Room 2501, 10 o'clock, and bring the documentation you've been keeping about the technical problems with the expansion strategy." "How did you know I was documenting?" "Because you're thorough and you care about this company. I'll see you at 10. Next, I called David, the security guard, at his direct line. "David, it's Jean Claude. I need a favor." "Miss Claude, I thought you were. I mean after yesterday. I need you to be present at this morning's board meeting. Not as security, but as a witness. Can you do that for me?" "I'm not sure I understand." "You will. Room 2501 at 10 o'clock. And David, thank you for what you said yesterday. It meant more than you could possibly know." By 8 a.m., I was in my car, driving toward Morrison Tech for what would either be my greatest triumph or my most spectacular failure. As I pulled into the executive parking garage, using the key card that had never been deactivated from my original CEO access, I felt a calmness settle over me that I hadn't experienced in months. I took the private elevator to the 25th floor, bypassing the floors where Jonas and his team were undoubtedly preparing their presentation. The boardroom was empty when I arrived, exactly as I'd expected. I had 90 minutes to set the stage for what was about to unfold. I placed a manila folder at each seat around the conference table, folders containing documentation that would change everything. Financial records showing the true cost of the executive team's decisions. Email threads revealing their casual contempt for employees and clients. Performance metrics demonstrating the company's decline under their leadership. But most importantly, legal documents that would prove beyond any doubt who actually owned Morrison Tech. At 9:30, Robert Chen arrived, looking surprised to find me already there. "Jean, I didn't expect you to be here so early. How are you holding up after yesterday's incident?" I smiled, gesturing for him to take his usual seat at the table. "Robert, I'm about to show you that yesterday's incident was the best thing that could have happened to this company." His eyebrows rose. "That's a remarkably positive attitude, considering the circumstances. Sometimes you have to lose everything before you can reclaim what was always yours." The other board members began arriving at 9:45, 5 investors who had believed in Morrison Tech's potential and trusted the executive team to deliver on that promise. They greeted me with sympathetic nods and carefully neutral expressions, clearly uncomfortable about my presence but too polite to ask me to leave. At 9:55, Emma Morrison entered with Marcus Chen and Sarah Lambert, looking nervous but determined. They took seats along the wall, unsure of their role but trusting that I knew what I was doing. David, the security guard, arrived at 9:58, positioning himself near the door with the quiet professionalism that had made me hire him in the first place. And at exactly 10 a.m., Jonas Lambert strode into the room with Kevin Morrison, Tom Eaton, and Clara Lambert flanking him, their arms full of presentation materials and their faces glowing with confidence. The moment Jonas saw me sitting at the conference table, his expression shifted from confidence to confusion to anger in rapid succession. What is she doing here? He demanded, pointing at me like I was some kind of contamination. I thought we made it clear yesterday that her services were no longer required. Robert Chen cleared his throat. Jonas, Jean requested to address the board before your presentation. Given the circumstances of her departure, we felt it was appropriate to hear her concerns. Concerns. Jonas's voice rose slightly. She has no standing to voice concerns about anything. She was a consultant who overstepped her boundaries and was terminated for cause. I stood up slowly, enjoying the way his confident smirk faltered as I walked to the head of the table, the position he had expected to occupy for his grand presentation. Actually, Jonas, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my role here. I opened the folder in front of Robert Chen's seat and watched his face as he began to read the documents inside. You see, for the past 6 months, I haven't been just a consultant observing Morrison Tech's operations. I paused, meeting Jonas's increasingly confused gaze. I've been the owner, watching you run my company. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert Chen's face had gone pale as he stared at the ownership documents in front of him. The other board members were frantically opening their own folders, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to understanding. Jonas was frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, his presentation materials suddenly forgotten in his hands. Ladies and gentlemen, I continued, my voice steady and clear, allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Jean Morrison Claude. I am the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Morrison Tech. Emma Morrison gasped audibly. Marcus and Sarah were staring at me with expressions of complete amazement. David the security guard was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time since I'd known him. But it was Jonas's face that I focused on as the full impact of my words sank in. The arrogance was gone, the smirk had vanished. In its place was a growing horror as he realized exactly what he had done. He had called the owner of the company pathetic. He had publicly humiliated his own boss. He had fired the woman who signed his paychecks and planned to celebrate her departure. Now then, I said, settling into my chair at the head of the table, shall we discuss the real state of Morrison Tech? The silence in the boardroom stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. I could see the gears turning in everyone's minds as they processed what I had just revealed. Robert Chen was the first to recover, his business instincts kicking in as he began to understand the full scope of what had been happening. Jean, or should I say, Miss Morrison Claude, I think we need to understand exactly what's been going on here, he said, his voice careful but clearly supportive. Are you telling us that you've been operating undercover in your own company for 6 months? I nodded, my gaze sweeping across the room. That's exactly what I'm telling you. After the executive team effectively removed me from operational control 18 months ago, I decided to take a different approach to understanding what was really happening at Morrison Tech. Jonas finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. This is impossible. You can't be the owner. We have contracts, we have authority, you have authority that I delegated to you. I interrupted, my tone still calm but carrying an edge of steel. Authority that was contingent on you acting in the company's best interests. Authority that you have systematically abused. I opened my own folder and pulled out a document that made Jonas's face go white. This is the original organizational restructuring agreement that you presented to the board 18 months ago. The one that supposedly gave you operational control while I retained the CEO title. I held up the document so everyone could see it. What you may not have noticed, Jonas, is the clause on page 12 that allows me to revoke this delegation of authority at any time if I determine that the leadership team is acting against the company's interests. Clara Lambert, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly spoke up. You can't just, there are procedures, there are proper channels, Clara, I said, turning to face the woman I had once considered a friend. You mean the HR procedures that you helped design? The ones that conveniently make it nearly impossible for employees to challenge executive decisions. I pulled out another document. This is a compilation of complaints that have been filed with HR over the past year. Complaints about the toxic work environment, about executive decisions that contradict technical expertise, about the systematic dismissal of employee concerns. Every single one was dismissed without investigation. Emma Morrison was staring at me with an expression of awe mixed with vindication. That's why you asked me all those questions. You already knew what we were dealing with. I knew some of it, I admitted. But I needed to see the full extent of how the culture had changed. I needed to understand whether the problems were systemic or isolated. Marcus Chen from development leaned forward in his chair. So when you challenged the expansion strategy in Monday's meeting, I was trying to prevent a disaster, I finished. The technical requirements for the expansion are impossible with our current infrastructure. The financial projections are based on outdated market data. The timeline assumes we can hire and train personnel at rates that don't exist in the current job market. Tom Eaton, who had been growing paler by the minute, suddenly exploded. This is insane. You can't just spy on your own executives and then ambush us in a board meeting. I looked at him with the patience one might show a child having a tantrum. Tom, I've been documenting every decision, every email, every meeting where you and your colleagues discussed company business, including the conversations where you referred to employees as dead weight and clients as cash cows to be milked. The board members were now fully engaged, leaning forward and taking notes as the full picture of the executive team's behavior became clear. Robert Chen spoke up again. Jean, what exactly are you proposing? Obviously, the current leadership structure isn't working, but what's your solution? This was the moment I had been building toward. I'm proposing that we return Morrison Tech to the principles that made it successful in the first place. Merit-based decision-making. Technical expertise valued over political maneuvering. Employee input respected and encouraged. I gestured toward Emma, Marcus and Sarah. These three people have been documenting the real problems facing our company, while the executive team focused on expansion fantasies. They have solutions, innovations and insights that have been systematically ignored. Jonas finally seemed to realize the gravity of his situation. Wait, you can't just, we have contracts, we have employment agreements. You have employment agreements that include termination clauses for failure to perform duties in accordance with company values, I said, matter-of-factly. Clara, I'm sure you remember reviewing those clauses when you helped draft them. Clara's face had taken on a grayish pallor. Jean, surely we can work this out. There's been some miscommunication, some misunderstandings. Miscommunication. I pulled out a printed email. This is the message thread where you all planned to fire me with security escort, because you thought I might become unstable. Where you celebrated replacing me with Tom's unqualified sister. Where you called me pathetic and planned a dinner to celebrate my departure. The room fell silent again. Even Kevin Morrison, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, seemed to understand that there was no coming back from this. Robert Chen cleared his throat. Jean, I think I speak for the entire board when I say that we support your decision to resume full operational control of Morrison Tech. What do you need from us? I smiled for the first time since the meeting began. I need you to support a complete restructuring of the executive team. I need you to approve new leadership positions for people who have actually demonstrated competence and commitment to the company's success. I looked directly at Emma. I'm offering you the position of Chief Technology Officer. Your understanding of our systems and your dedication to quality make you the obvious choice. Emma's mouth dropped open. Yes, absolutely yes. I turned to Marcus, Head of Development, reporting directly to Emma. Your innovative approaches have been ignored for too long. Then to Sarah, Director of Client Relations, with authority to implement the service improvements you've been proposing. Finally, I looked at David, still standing by the door. David, I'm creating a new position for you. Director of Corporate Culture. Your job will be to ensure that Morrison Tech remains a place where people are treated with respect and dignity. The executive team was staring at me in shock as I systematically dismantled everything they thought they controlled and rebuilt it around people who had actually earned their positions. As for the current executive team, I said, my voice taking on a formal tone, effective immediately, your employment with Morrison Tech is terminated. Jonas started to protest, but I held up my hand. You'll receive the severance packages outlined in your contracts, and I'll provide neutral references that focus on your technical qualifications rather than your leadership failures. But your time at Morrison Tech is over. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months. The age of politics and ego is over. Morrison Tech is returning to its roots as a company that values innovation, competence, and respect. Robert Chen was nodding approvingly.
Yeah.
This is exactly what the company needed. The board fully supports this transition. As the former executive team filed out in stunned silence, I turned to my new leadership team, people who had proven their worth through dedication rather than credentials. Welcome to the new Morrison Tech, I said. Now let's get to work. The boardroom began to empty as the former executive team made their silent, humiliated exit. Jonas was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at me with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been respect, or perhaps just the recognition of a superior strategist. You planned this from the beginning, he said quietly. I met his gaze steadily. No, Jonas, you planned this from the beginning. I just decided how it would end. After he left, I turned my attention to the people who would help me rebuild Morrison Tech into the company it was meant to be. Robert Chen and the board members were already deep in discussion about the transition logistics, but my focus was on Emma, Marcus, Sarah, and David, the individuals who had been undervalued and overlooked but who possessed the genuine competence the company needed. Before we celebrate, I said, calling their attention back to the matter at hand, we need to address the immediate challenges. Emma, what's the current status of our development timeline given the technical constraints we discussed? Emma straightened in her chair, her earlier nervousness replaced by professional confidence. We're about 6 weeks behind where the expansion timeline assumed we'd be. The infrastructure upgrades alone will take 3 months, not the 6 weeks Jonas allocated. And that's assuming we can find qualified personnel, which is increasingly difficult in the current market. What would you need to get us back on track? Honestly, we need to scale back the expansion to something realistic. Focus on strengthening our core systems before we try to grow. Maybe target a 30% expansion over 18 months instead of 100% over 6 months. I nodded.
Oh.
That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need. Marcus, from a development perspective, what are your priorities? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm of someone who was finally being heard. We've been putting band-aids on technical debt for months because we haven't had time for proper code refactoring. If we could allocate 2 months to cleaning up our existing systems, we'd be in a much better position to handle any expansion. And Sarah, What are you hearing from our clients? Sarah pulled out a tablet and scrolled through her notes. They're concerned about service quality degradation. Response times are up 40% over the past 6 months, and we've had 3 major clients express concerns about whether we can handle their growing needs. But they're willing to be patient if we can show them a realistic improvement plan. This was exactly what I had hoped to hear, real problems identified by people who understood both the technical and business implications, along with practical solutions, rather than wishful thinking. David, I said, turning to our new director of corporate culture, what have you observed about employee morale during this transition? David's expression grew serious. There's been a lot of fear and uncertainty, especially after yesterday's incident. People are worried about their jobs, about whether the company is stable, but there's also hope. When word started spreading about what happened in this meeting, I saw more genuine smiles than I've seen in months. Robert Chen spoke up from his position at the table. Jian, what's your timeline for communicating these changes to the rest of the company? I checked my watch. It was 11:30 a.m. I want to address the entire company at 2 p.m. today. Everyone needs to understand what's happening and where we're headed. But first, I need to spend some time with our new leadership team, making sure we have a unified vision. I looked around the room at these 4 people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued by the previous regime. Here's what I want you to understand. You weren't chosen for these positions because I needed to fill slots, or because you were convenient. You were chosen because you've demonstrated competence, integrity, and genuine care for Morrison Tech's success. Emma nodded slowly. What about the people who supported Jonas and his team? There are going to be employees who bought into their vision, who might resist these changes. That's a fair concern, I acknowledged. But I think you'll find that most of the resistance came from fear rather than genuine support. When people see that their expertise is valued, that their concerns are heard, that they're treated with respect rather than condescension, most will adapt quickly. Marcus raised his hand slightly. What about the expansion strategy? Do we abandon it completely, or do we try to salvage parts of it? We redesign it based on reality rather than wishful thinking, I said. Emma's timeline makes sense. Your focus on technical debt is exactly right. Sarah's client feedback tells us we need to strengthen our foundation before we build higher. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. Let me show you what I learned during my 6 months as an observer. I began sketching out an organizational chart that reflected the realities I'd witnessed, rather than the hierarchies that existed on paper. This is how decisions actually got made under the previous system. Notice how the people doing the work had no input into the strategic planning. The new leadership team studied the diagram, nodding as they recognized the dysfunction they'd lived with for months. Now here's how we're going to restructure. I drew a new chart, one that showed clear lines of communication between technical teams and strategic planning. Your departments will have direct input into business strategy. Your expertise will drive our decisions, not the other way around. David was taking notes rapidly. This is going to require a significant culture shift. People have gotten used to being told what to do, rather than being asked what should be done, which is exactly why your role is so important, I replied. We need to rebuild trust, restore communication, and remind people why they came to work for Morrison Tech in the first place. Robert Chen checked his own watch. Jean, you mentioned wanting to address the company at 2 p.m. What message do you want to send? I set down the marker and turned back to face the group. The message is simple. Morrison Tech is returning to its founding principles. Merit matters. Expertise is valued. Innovation is encouraged. And every person in this company has a voice that deserves to be heard. Emma was smiling now, a genuine expression of hope and excitement. When do we start? I looked around the room at these 4 people who would help me rebuild everything that had been damaged, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine optimism about Morrison Tech's future. "We start right now," I said. "Let's go show this company what real leadership looks like." By 1:45 p.m., word had spread throughout Morrison Tech like wildfire. I could see it in the faces of employees as I walked through the floors with my new leadership team, a mixture of curiosity, hope, and barely contained excitement. The whispers followed us through the hallways. "She's the owner. She fired the entire executive team. Everything's about to change." The main auditorium was packed when we arrived. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls and spilling into the doorways. I recognized faces from every department: developers who had been working impossible schedules, customer service representatives who had been absorbing client complaints with no authority to fix underlying problems, administrative staff who had been treated like invisible furniture by the previous regime. As I walked onto the stage, the room fell silent. These people had spent months, some of them years, watching their company slowly deteriorate under leadership that valued credentials over competence, politics over performance. They had no idea what to expect from this moment, but they were desperate for something different. I stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces staring back at me. These were the people who had built Morrison Tech's reputation, who had worked late nights to meet impossible deadlines, who had watched their expertise dismissed by executives who didn't understand the work being done. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jean Morrison Claude. I founded this company 5 years ago, and I am its owner." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even though the rumors had been circulating, hearing it stated so directly still had impact. "For the past 6 months, I have been working among you as a consultant, observing how this company operates, listening to your concerns, and documenting the challenges you face every day. What I discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating." I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I discovered that talented, dedicated professionals were being ignored while incompetent executives made decisions that undermined everything you worked to build. I discovered that your expertise was being dismissed as irrelevant, while people with impressive resumes, but no understanding of our business made strategic choices that endangered our future." Heads were nodding throughout the audience. These people had lived this reality. They recognized the truth in my words. I discovered that Morrison Tech had lost its way. We had forgotten that our strength comes not from impressive titles or fancy credentials, but from the knowledge, creativity, and dedication of people who understand both our technology and our mission. Emma Morrison was sitting in the front row, and I could see tears in her eyes. Next to her, Marcus Chen was smiling with an expression of vindication I recognized from my own emotional journey over the past months. Effective immediately, Morrison Tech is returning to its founding principles. Every employee's expertise will be valued. Every voice will be heard. Every contribution will be recognized. The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping uncertainly. But as I continued speaking, it grew stronger and more confident. "The expansion strategy that was going to push you to impossible deadlines while ignoring technical realities. Cancelled. We will grow sustainably, based on what our systems can actually support and what our clients actually need." More applause, this time accompanied by visible relief on faces throughout the audience. The culture of fear that made people afraid to speak up when they saw problems? Over. I want to hear your concerns, your ideas, your solutions. You are the experts in your fields, and this company succeeds when we listen to expertise. I gestured toward Emma, Marcus, Sarah, and David, who were sitting together in the front section. "Let me introduce you to Morrison Tech's new executive team. Emma Morrison, our new Chief Technology Officer, who has spent 3 years ensuring that our systems actually work, while being told her concerns weren't strategic priorities. Emma stood and waved, her smile radiant as the entire development section erupted in applause. Marcus Chen, our new head of development, who has been developing innovative solutions while being told to focus on more important tasks. Marcus's recognition was met with equally enthusiastic applause from his colleagues. Sarah Lambert, our new director of client relations, who has been absorbing client complaints about problems she wasn't allowed to fix. Sarah's appointment clearly resonated with the customer-facing teams, who clapped with obvious approval. And David Morrison, our new director of corporate culture, who will ensure that Morrison Tech remains a place where people are treated with dignity and respect. David's promotion drew applause from throughout the auditorium, but I could see it was particularly strong from the administrative and support staff who had worked with him over the years. These promotions aren't based on who has an MBA from the right school, or who knows the right people. They're based on who has demonstrated competence, integrity, and genuine commitment to Morrison Tech's success. A woman from the QA department raised her hand. What about the rest of us? How do we know this isn't just replacing one set of executives with another? It was exactly the question I had hoped someone would ask. Because the entire structure is changing, I replied. Under the old system, executives made decisions and you implemented them. Under the new system, you identify problems and opportunities, propose solutions, and participate in the strategic planning process. I walked to the edge of the stage, getting as close to the audience as possible. I spent 6 months watching talented people like you be dismissed and ignored. I watched as your expertise was treated as irrelevant while people who didn't understand your work made decisions that made your jobs harder. That ends today. The applause was sustained now, filled with genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation. Next week, every department will meet with our new leadership team to discuss their priorities, their challenges, and their ideas for improvement. Your input will drive our strategic planning, not the other way around. A man from the IT department called out, "What about the people who supported the old executive team? Are we going to be punished for following orders?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "You were doing your jobs under difficult circumstances. The only people being held accountable are those who created those circumstances. Everyone else gets a fresh start and a chance to show what they can do when their expertise is valued." As I looked out at the faces in the auditorium, I saw something I hadn't seen at Morrison Tech in over a year. Real, genuine optimism about the company's future. Morrison Tech was built on the principle that technology should solve real problems for real people. We lost sight of that principle, but we're going to rediscover it together. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had since the day I first signed the lease on this building. Welcome to the new Morrison Tech. Let's get back to changing the world. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes. 3 days after my address to the company, I was in my office, my real office, with my name on the door and my original furniture restored, when my assistant knocked and entered with an expression of concern. "Miss Claude, there's a problem. Jonas Lambert is in the lobby demanding to see you. He says he has something important to discuss about the transition." I set down the quarterly report I'd been reviewing and checked my watch. It was 6:30 p.m. on a Friday. Well past normal business hours. Most of the building was empty except for security and a few dedicated employees working late. Did he say what he wanted to discuss? No, but he seems agitated. Security asked if they should escort him out, but he insists he has legal grounds to be here. Legal grounds. That was interesting. Jonas had been terminated with full severance and a non-compete clause that should have prevented him from interfering with Morrison Tech's operations. What could he possibly think gave him legal standing? "Send him up," I said. "But ask David to remain nearby, just in case." 10 minutes later, Jonas walked into my office, looking nothing like the confident executive who had publicly humiliated me just days earlier. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie slightly askew, and there was a desperate edge to his expression that I'd never seen before. "Jean," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "We need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where he had sat countless times over the past 18 months, making decisions about my company, while I was excluded from the process. "What can I do for you, Jonas?" He sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. You can't just destroy people's careers because you had your feelings hurt." I kept my expression neutral. "I didn't destroy anyone's career. I terminated employees who were actively damaging the company I built." "Actively damaging." His voice rose. "We tripled your revenue. We expanded your market share. We turned Morrison Tech into a serious player in the industry. You created unsustainable growth based on exploiting employees and misleading clients," I replied calmly. "The revenue increase came at the cost of service quality, employee satisfaction, and long-term stability." Jonas leaned forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "You have no idea what it takes to run a real company. You built a nice little startup, sure, but scaling requires tough decisions. It requires leadership that can make hard choices without getting emotional about every employee complaint." There it was, the condescension that had driven so many of his decisions. Even now, facing the consequences of his actions, he couldn't see employees as anything more than obstacles to efficiency. "Jonas, why are you here? Your severance package was generous. Your non-disclosure agreement protects your reputation, and your non-compete clause expires in 6 months. What more do you want?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more vulnerable. "Kevin, Tom, and Clara, we all signed long-term contracts when we joined Morrison Tech, contracts that promised stock options, profit sharing, executive benefits through the IPO process. You can't just tear up those agreements because you decided you don't like our management style." Now I understood. This wasn't about wounded pride or professional reputation. This was about money, significant money that they had been counting on when Morrison Tech went public. "Those contracts," I said carefully, "were contingent on performance metrics and adherence to company values. Your terminations were for cause, which voids the long-term benefit provisions." Jonas's face went pale. "You can't prove cause. Some personality conflicts and strategic disagreements don't constitute grounds for termination with cause." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, the same documentation I had prepared for the board meeting, but expanded with additional evidence I had been gathering for months. "Jonas, I have detailed records of every decision you made that prioritized politics over performance. Every email where you dismissed employee expertise. Every meeting where you treated talented professionals like inconveniences. Every instance where you violated the leadership principles that Morrison Tech was built on." I placed the folder on the desk between us. "I also have documentation of the harassment and humiliation you orchestrated against me personally, including the security escort you arranged, and the celebration dinner you planned after my termination." He stared at the folder like it was a venomous snake. "This isn't over," he said quietly, standing up from his chair. "There are legal options. Employment attorneys who specialize in wrongful termination. I'm not going to let you destroy my career because you couldn't handle being managed by someone more qualified." I looked up at him steadily. "Jonas, you're free to pursue whatever legal remedies you think are appropriate. But before you do, I'd suggest you carefully review the documentation in those files. And remember that any legal action you take will become public record." His jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. "Your career wasn't destroyed by me," I continued softly. It was destroyed by your own choices, your own actions, your own failure to understand that leadership means serving the people you lead, not exploiting them. Jonas turned and walked toward the door, but paused at the threshold. You think you've won, he said without turning around. But running a company based on employee feelings and democratic decision-making isn't sustainable. Within 6 months, you'll be begging me to come back and fix the mess you're about to create. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. I'll take that bet, Jonas. See you in 6 months. After he left, I sat in the quiet of my office, processing what had just happened. This confrontation had been inevitable. Jonas's ego couldn't accept that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. But his threats didn't worry me. I had documentation, I had witnesses, and most importantly, I had a company full of talented people who were finally free to do their best work. The real battle was just beginning, but I was confident about which side would win. 2 weeks later, I discovered that Jonas hadn't been bluffing about his legal options. I was reviewing quarterly projections with Emma when my assistant rushed into the conference room, her face pale with concern. Miss Claude, you need to see this immediately. She handed me her tablet, which was displaying a news article with a headline that made my stomach drop. Morrison Tech CEO accused of corporate espionage and fraud by former executives. The article, published by Tech Business Weekly, detailed allegations that I had used my consulting position to steal proprietary information, manipulate board members, and orchestrate a hostile takeover of my own company. The quotes attributed to Jonas were particularly damaging. Jean-Claude systematically deceived the board and employees about her intentions. The article quoted him as saying, "She used confidential information obtained under false pretenses to undermine legitimate business operations and destroy the careers of qualified professionals." Emma was reading over my shoulder, her expression growing more incredulous with each paragraph. "This is insane. How can they publish something like this without fact-checking?" I scrolled down to find even worse accusations. Tom Eaton was quoted claiming that I had fabricated evidence and violated fiduciary duties, while Clara Lambert alleged that I had created a hostile work environment and engaged in retaliatory behavior against executives who questioned my competence. But the most damaging quote came from Kevin Morrison, who claimed that I had mental health issues that made me unsuitable for leadership positions, and suggested that my actions were driven by personal vendettas rather than business judgment. "They're trying to destroy your credibility," Emma said, her voice tight with anger. "This isn't just about their contracts anymore. They're trying to make you look unstable and vindictive." My phone started buzzing with calls. Reporters, board members, clients who had seen the article and were concerned about Morrison Tech's stability. Within an hour, the story had been picked up by 3 other business publications, each adding their own speculation about the corporate drama at Morrison Tech. The most frustrating part was how they had twisted the truth. Yes, I had operated under a consulting identity, but it was my own company. Yes, I had documented their behavior, but it was legitimate oversight of employees who were damaging the business. Yes, I had terminated them, but it was for cause and fully within my rights as the owner. But in the court of public opinion, nuance didn't matter. The narrative they were spinning painted me as a deceptive, vindictive woman who had manipulated her way into power and then abused it to settle personal scores. By afternoon, the story had reached social media, where it took on a life of its own. Morrison Tech scandal was trending, with keyboard warriors debating whether I was a brilliant strategist or a corporate villain. The comments sections were brutal, filled with speculation about my mental state, my qualifications, and my motives. David knocked on my office door at 4 p.m. "Gian, we need to talk about employee morale. People are scared. They're getting calls from friends and family asking if they should be looking for new jobs. I set down my phone, where I had been watching our stock price fluctuate wildly as investors tried to process the conflicting narratives. How bad is it? Some people are standing by you completely. They know what Jonas and his team were really like, but others are starting to wonder if maybe there's some truth to the allegations. The uncertainty is killing productivity. This was exactly what Jonas had hoped to achieve. He couldn't win in the boardroom or the courtroom, so he was trying to win in the media. By creating doubt about my credibility and competence, he was hoping to force the board to reconsider his termination, or at least damage Morrison Tech enough that my leadership would fail. Emma appeared in the doorway. "Jean, Robert Chen is on line 1. He says it's urgent." I picked up the phone, bracing myself for what was coming. "Jean?" Robert's voice was strained. "The board needs to meet tomorrow morning. This media coverage is creating serious concerns among our investors, and we need to address it immediately. Robert, you know these allegations are baseless. You were there when I revealed my identity. You saw the documentation. I know that, and you know that, but the public doesn't know that. Our stock price is down 12%. We've had 3 clients call asking about our stability, and I've got investors demanding answers." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. "What are you thinking?" "We need a comprehensive response. Legal action against the former executives for defamation, a detailed public statement setting the record straight, and probably a press conference where you can address the allegations directly." A press conference. The thought of facing a room full of reporters armed with Jonas's accusations made my stomach clench, but I knew Robert was right. "Schedule it," I said. "If Jonas wants to fight dirty, we'll show him what real transparency looks like." As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was no longer just about Morrison Tech's future. It was about whether truth and evidence could overcome lies and manipulation in the age of viral misinformation. The real war was just beginning. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 a.m., exactly 1 week after the allegations first surfaced. I had spent every waking hour of those 7 days preparing with our legal team, gathering documentation, and coordinating with the board to ensure we presented a unified, unshakable response. As I walked into the packed auditorium, I could feel the weight of dozens of cameras and the intense scrutiny of reporters who had been covering the Morrison Tech scandal all week. The room buzzed with anticipation. They were expecting drama, corporate intrigue, and possibly the downfall of a CEO who had been painted as either a brilliant strategist or a delusional manipulator. I took my place at the podium, flanked by Robert Chen and our chief legal counsel, Maria Santos. Behind me, a large screen displayed the Morrison Tech logo. In front of me sat a room full of skeptical journalists who had been fed a week of Jonas's carefully crafted narrative. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I'm here today to address the allegations that have been made against me and Morrison Tech over the past week. But before I respond to these claims, I want to show you something." I nodded to Maria, who activated the presentation system. The first slide appeared on the screen behind me, a legal document with official seals and signatures. This is the original incorporation document for Morrison Tech, filed 5 years ago. As you can see, I am listed as the sole founder and owner of this company. I paused, letting that sink in. Every decision I have made regarding Morrison Tech has been made as its legal owner, not as some outsider attempting a hostile takeover. The murmur that ran through the audience told me they were beginning to understand the fundamental flaw in Jonas's narrative. The second document, I continued as Maria advanced the slide, is the consulting agreement I signed 6 months ago under the name Jean-Claude. This agreement was entirely legitimate, and was entered into with full board approval as part of a comprehensive company evaluation. A reporter from Tech Business Weekly, the same publication that had broken the original story, raised her hand. Miss Morrison Claude, why did you feel the need to operate under a false identity in your own company? I had been expecting this question. Because the executive team had created a culture where honest feedback was not welcome. Employees were afraid to voice concerns, and strategic problems were being ignored or dismissed. The only way to get an accurate assessment of the company's real condition was to observe operations without the bias that my known presence would create. But didn't this deception constitute fraud? Another reporter called out. There was no deception, I replied firmly. Jean-Claude is my legal name. Jean is my middle name, and Claude is my grandmother's maiden name, which I use professionally. I never lied about my qualifications or experience. I simply allowed the executive team to make assumptions about my relationship to the company. Maria advanced to the next slide, which showed email threads and meeting transcripts. What I discovered during those 6 months was systematic mismanagement, financial irregularities, and a toxic workplace culture that was driving away talented employees and alienating clients. I gestured to the screen. These are documented examples of the former executive team's behavior. Not opinions or interpretations, but actual emails and recorded conversations showing how they treated employees, clients, and the company's resources. The room had grown quiet. I could see reporters taking notes, their expressions shifting from skepticism to serious attention. Now, let me address the specific allegations that have been made. I looked directly at the Tech Business Weekly reporter. Mr. Lambert claims I engaged in corporate espionage. The truth is, I was conducting legitimate oversight of my own company. Mr. Eaton claims fabricated evidence. Every document I've presented has been verified by independent auditors. Ms. Lambert claims I created a hostile work environment. Employee satisfaction surveys from before and after the executive team's departure tell a very different story. Maria displayed a graph showing employee satisfaction metrics. As you can see, workplace satisfaction has increased by 67% since the leadership transition. Client retention is up 23%. And our stock price, despite the recent volatility caused by these false allegations, is still 15% higher than it was under the previous management. A reporter from Financial Daily leaned forward. What about the allegations regarding your mental health and fitness for leadership? I smiled, not bitterly, but with genuine amusement. I think my record speaks for itself. I built Morrison Tech from nothing into a profitable company with over 500 employees. I identified and documented serious management problems. I implemented solutions that have already shown measurable improvements. If that's what mental instability looks like, I'll take it. The laughter that rippled through the room told me the tide was turning. Finally, I said, my voice taking on a more serious tone, I want to address the real issue here. This isn't about corporate governance or business strategy. This is about 4 individuals who were terminated for cause, who lost significant financial benefits as a result, and who are now attempting to damage both my reputation and Morrison Tech's stability as retaliation. I looked directly into the cameras. I have documentation, witnesses, and evidence to support every action I've taken. If Mr. Lambert and his associates want to continue this fight in court, they're welcome to do so. But they should understand that discovery goes both ways, and I'm confident that the full truth will vindicate every decision I've made. As I concluded the press conference, I could see the change in the room. The hostile skepticism had been replaced by professional respect and genuine curiosity about the real story behind Morrison Tech's transformation. Within hours, the narrative had completely shifted. The headlines now read, Morrison Tech CEO presents evidence against fraud claims, and documentation contradicts former executives' allegations. Jonas had tried to destroy me with lies and manipulation. Instead, he had given me the platform to demonstrate exactly why truth and transparency would always triumph over politics and deception. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same boardroom where I had first revealed my identity, reviewing Morrison Tech's most successful quarterly report in company history. The numbers were extraordinary: revenue up 45%, client satisfaction at an all-time high, employee retention at 94%, and 3 major industry awards for innovation and workplace culture. Robert Chen was beaming as he read through the investor presentation. Gee, these results are beyond what anyone projected. The market confidence is higher than it's ever been. Emma Morrison, now fully settled into her role as CTO, pulled up the technical metrics on her laptop. The infrastructure improvements have eliminated 90% of our service issues. Marcus's development team is consistently ahead of schedule, and Sarah's client relations department has a waiting list of companies wanting to work with us. David knocked and entered with his usual quiet efficiency. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to know. Jonas Lambert just accepted a position with Technologic Solutions. I raised an eyebrow. Technologic Solutions was Morrison Tech's primary competitor, a company known for high employee turnover and aggressive business practices. Interesting choice for him. Gets better, David continued with a slight smile. According to my contacts there, he's taken a middle management position. No executive authority, no strategic input. Essentially, he's doing the kind of work he used to dismiss as beneath his expertise. The irony was perfect. Jonas had spent months trying to prove that Morrison Tech would fail without his leadership, while simultaneously watching us thrive. His new role, reporting to executives who made the same kinds of decisions he used to make, was the corporate equivalent of poetic justice. What about the others? Emma asked. Kevin Morrison is working as a marketing consultant for small businesses. Tom Eden joined a regional accounting firm. Clara Lambert is doing HR for a non-profit organization. David paused. None of them are making anywhere near what they were earning here. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet sense that justice had been served. They had chosen to prioritize their own advancement over the company's welfare, and the market had responded accordingly. Any word on the legal front? Robert asked. Their attorney withdrew the defamation suit last month. Apparently, the discovery process made it clear that they had no viable case. I smiled. Turns out having documentation and evidence trumps having good lawyers. As the meeting concluded and everyone filed out, I remained in the boardroom for a few minutes, looking out at the city skyline. Morrison Tech had not only survived the chaos of the past year, it had emerged stronger, more focused, and more successful than ever. The company I had built was finally the company I had always envisioned, a place where talent was rewarded, expertise was valued, and every employee had a voice in shaping the future. Jonas had been wrong about everything, but especially about one thing: running a company based on respect and collaboration wasn't just sustainable, it was the key to unprecedented success. The call came on a Tuesday evening, just as I was finishing up some late paperwork in my office. My assistant had left hours ago, and the building was quiet except for the hum of servers and the distant sound of the night cleaning crew. When I saw Jonas Lambert's name on my phone screen, I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since that confrontational meeting in my office 8 months ago, and I had no desire to rehash old grievances. But curiosity got the better of me. Hello, Jonas. There was a long pause before he spoke, and when he did, His voice sounded different, smaller, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. Jean, he cleared his throat. I wanted to call and apologize. I leaned back in my chair, genuinely surprised. Apologize? For everything. For the way I treated you, for the public accusations, for trying to destroy what you built. His voice was steady, but I could hear something like exhaustion underneath it. You were right about everything, and I was too proud to see it. I said nothing, letting him continue. Technologic Solutions runs exactly the way I thought Morrison Tech should run. Executives make all the decisions, employees shut up and follow orders, and anyone who questions the strategy gets marginalized or fired. He laughed bitterly. It's everything I said I wanted, and it's a miserable place to work. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Are you? Because you'd have every right to enjoy watching me fail. He paused. I've been following Morrison Tech's progress. The awards, the growth, the employee satisfaction surveys. You didn't just prove me wrong, you proved that everything I believed about leadership was backwards. I looked out my office window at the city lights, thinking about how to respond. Jonas, the truth is, I never wanted you to fail. I wanted you to succeed, but not at the expense of the people who worked for you. I know that now. I knew it even then, deep down. But I was so convinced that being tough meant being cruel, that leadership meant making people afraid of you. His voice dropped. I turned into everything I used to hate about corporate culture, and I dragged good people down with me. What are you going to do now? Honestly, I don't know. I'm thinking about leaving corporate leadership altogether. Maybe teaching or consulting for companies that actually want to treat their employees well. He paused. Would you ever consider giving me a reference? Not for an executive position, but for something where I could maybe help other companies avoid the mistakes I made. The request surprised me, but as I thought about it, it made sense. Jonas had learned lessons the hard way. Lessons that could prevent other companies from making the same errors. Send me the details when you're ready, I said. I think you could do some good if you're genuinely committed to changing. Thank you. The relief in his voice was palpable. And Jean, congratulations on everything you've accomplished. Morrison Tech is lucky to have you back where you belong. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office, processing the conversation. Jonas's apology didn't erase the pain he had caused, or the damage he had tried to inflict, but it did something more important. It confirmed that the approach I had taken, leading with principles rather than power, had been worth defending. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't crushing your enemies, but watching them become better people. 1 year after the boardroom revelation that changed everything, I found myself standing in the same spot where I had once been escorted out by security, the main lobby of Morrison Tech. But this time, I wasn't leaving in humiliation. I was greeting the newest members of our team during our monthly new employee orientation. The lobby had been transformed. Gone were the cold marble surfaces and intimidating corporate artwork that Jonas had favored. In their place were comfortable seating areas, living walls of plants, and digital displays showcasing employee achievements and innovative projects. Most importantly, there was laughter, genuine, relaxed conversation between colleagues who respected each other. Miss Claude, a young woman approached me, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone starting their dream job. I'm Alba Morrison. I just started in the development team. I wanted to thank you for creating the kind of company I always hoped to work for. Alba Morrison. The name was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. Then I remembered. She was Tom Eden's sister, the one Clara had wanted to hire as my replacement when they planned to fire me. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was now joining Morrison Tech on her own merits, through the rigorous interview process Emma had designed to identify genuine talent. Welcome to Morrison Tech, Alba. What drew you to our company? Her smile was infectious. Honestly, everything I heard about how you treat employees, how you value expertise over politics, how you actually listen to the people doing the work. My brother used to complain about idealistic leadership, but from where I sit, idealism that works is just good business. As I walked through the building later that afternoon, I reflected on how much had changed. The open office spaces buzzed with collaborative energy. Conference rooms were booked solid with cross-departmental brainstorming sessions. The break rooms had been converted into innovation labs, where employees could work on passion projects that might benefit the company. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the physical space. It was in the culture. People spoke up when they had ideas. They challenged strategies when they saw flaws. They supported each other's success instead of competing for scraps of executive approval. Emma found me in my office as the day was winding down. Jean, I just got off a call with our biggest client. They want to expand their contract by 40% because they're so impressed with our responsiveness and innovation. That's wonderful. What made the difference? The fact that their account manager, Sarah, has the authority to actually solve problems instead of just escalating them to executives who don't understand the technical details. Emma grinned. It turns out that when you let experts be experts, amazing things happen. I laughed, remembering Jonas's certainty that employee empowerment would lead to chaos and inefficiency. Revolutionary concept. As Emma left, I turned to look out my window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Jonas was probably finishing his own workday at Technologic Solutions, hopefully learning that leadership didn't have to be a zero-sum game. Kevin, Tom, and Clara were building new careers, perhaps with a better understanding of what real teamwork looked like. And here at Morrison Tech, we were proving every day that respect, competence, and collaboration weren't just nice ideals. They were the foundation of extraordinary success. I had spent 6 months as an invisible observer, watching my company struggle under leadership that valued control over competence. Now I was witnessing something far more powerful. What happened when people were trusted to do their best work? The woman they had called pathetic was running a company that had become the gold standard for employee satisfaction and innovation in our industry. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being right.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.